Hello, hello. I am so glad we have this time together. I'm Sanaa Laybourne. I am a professor, scholar, connector, and avid reader. I've always loved learning about what's happening in our social world and sharing that knowledge, especially over a good cup of coffee. And so here we are. Each week on Let's Grab Coffee, I catch up with experts from across the country who are investigating our most pressing social issues and common curiosities. Over the next hour, you'll learn about their inspirations, motivations, and of course, what they know about the world around us. So go ahead and grab your cup of coffee and get ready for an engaging and insightful conversation. Recently, the Supreme Court ruled that colleges and universities cannot consider an applicant's race in college admissions. We will continue to see how this affirmative action ruling will affect other institutions and practices. This decision to ignore the historical injustices that affirmative action was meant to address, while also advancing an idea of reverse racism, is just one example of backlash to attempts for racial equality. In his latest book, American Whitelash, A Changing Nation and the Cost of Progress, Wesley Lowery contextualizes our present moment within U.S. history. Wesley Lowery is a Pulitzer Prize winning journalist and one of the nation's leading reporters on issues of race and justice. He is the executive editor of the Investigative Reporting Workshop at American University in Washington, D.C., that trains a rising generation of journalists by partnering them with professional newsrooms to work on projects that fill crucial gaps in media coverage. Wesley is also the author of the New York Times bestselling book, They Can't Kill Us All: Ferguson, Baltimore, and a New Era in America's Racial Justice Movement. He joins us today. Welcome, Wesley. It's such a pleasure to have you here.
Of course, I'm really, really looking forward to this conversation. It's going to be a ton of fun.
Yes, me too. I absolutely love the book. I think it is crucial for folks to read it and really get into the heart of what you have laid out here. But today we get a chance to talk a little bit about some of the main ideas in your book. So let's just jump right in with the obvious question: this idea of white lash. What does that mean?
Well, I think as we talk about this, we have to start first by defining and thinking about what whiteness is in an American context, right?
Hmm.
And I think I've been saying this. I think that anytime we talk about race, it's important for us to note and to understand that race is a sociological construct, a societal construct. It's not a biological reality, right?
Hmm.
And I think that's really important. And then people say, oh, yeah, of course, right? But I think sometimes when we have these conversations, we have them as if they are these like hardwired biological distinctions, right?
Hmm.
And the way that ethnicity might be, or the way that, but the reason I say that though is because to understand white lash, we have to understand whiteness, which means we have to understand that whiteness is not a biological thing, but rather it's a social construct we have created here in the United States of America. We wrote into our laws distinctions between white people and other people, right?
Hmm.
And initially that meant that people who were white were people who were not indigenous and were not black, right?
Hmm.
And then as other groups began arriving in the United States of America, they had to figure out where on the spectrum they belonged, on the spectrum between whiteness and not whiteness. And so when Italians arrived, for example, or Chinese Americans arrived, or the Jews arrived, or the Irish arrived, there were these moments where these immigrant groups, some of whom would now be perceived as white
Hmm.
in an American context, initially were not perceived that way. I think the deadliest lynching in American history was of Italians in New Orleans,
Hmm.
right? And it was racially driven. They were not seen, these Sicilian immigrants were not seen as being white. They were seen as a threat to it. So then we gets us to the idea of white supremacy, or a system of white supremacy, or white violence, right? And I know that definitions aren't fun, but they matter, right, to talk about these kind of
Hmm.
complicated things.
Absolutely.
So we get to white supremacy, right? That we were a foundationally like white supremacist system, right? That the actual infrastructure of our country, of our laws, created a system where people who were categorized as white received a set of freedoms and liberties and justice that other people didn't receive,
Hmm.
right? And so that's a white supremacist system. And so because of that, there have always been, and by the way, there are people who are the beneficiaries of that system, the people who are categorized as white. And so there have always been people who have been fighting to undo that white supremacist system, to create a multiracial democracy and multicultural society. right? There have always been people who've been fighting
Mm-hmm.
for that. And in response, there have always been people who have fought back, who said the status quo works. I'm the beneficiary of it.
Mm-hmm.
Or who get aggravated, get concerned, get scared in moments when there are steps or there is advancement towards that multiracial democracy, right? That you used to have 200% of the rights. Now you only have 175% of the rights, where all you can feel is that you lost 25%. Right. And
Mm-hmm.
that's real, right? You feel that loss, right?
Right.
And so what we see and what I think about as an American white are these moments, both explicitly violent, but then also times that are systemic, that are structural, right? Moments where, due to that anxiety of people who are socialized as white, that there is a backlash and a lashing out against advances and against steps towards multiracial democracy.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. I mean, Wesley, you said so much there, and I want to kind of unpack some of it because, so I'm a sociologist. I teach my students all the time about, that race is a social construct, and we go through a whole semester and they seem to be on board with this idea. But then when it comes to them talking about ideas and really trying to explain some of the inequities that we see, I often see students kind of revert back to this idea of biological races and that there are some sort of values or morals assigned to race as a biological construct. So I'm wondering if you could just go a little bit deeper into the idea of whiteness as a social construct and really bring out some of the ways that we've seen benefits or privileges tied to this idea of whiteness.
Certainly. And so again, we create this as a social and a political and a legal construct. We write it into some of the laws and documents going back to colonial times. Now, we're not even a union, we're not even a country yet, and we are defining people this way. There are theories and there's history to support the idea that we did this and that this was done on purpose, in part, to create a racial solidarity where a class and economic solidarity didn't exist, right? That in colonial Virginia, for example, you were seeing almost the overthrow of the colony because it was ruled by colonial aristocrats, colonial governors, who were heavily taxing and taking all the money from the laborers, who were largely indentured servants and enslaved people who were both white and black, and in some cases indigenous.
Mhm,
And in order to prevent a multiracial coalition from overthrowing them, which almost happened several times,
mhm,
they began creating these distinctions between the white indentured servants and the black enslaved people, right, or the indigenous enslaved people, and creating a hierarchy so that even the poorest, worse off white person could believe that they were not, in fact, at the bottom of the economic totem pole and believe that they had something to aspire to, right?
mhm,
Um, what we see moving forward throughout our history is how these ideas of whiteness determine who has access to power, who has access to capital. It's a sensibility that becomes and is created in terms of what our majority sensibility is, right? It speaks to, and we think about whose stories are prioritized, what and told, whose experiences are valued, whose history we've quantified versus whose we've had to go dig up, right? That again, the institutions that make up the foundation of our nation have themselves were founded and created at a time not to seek equality or freedom or justice or liberty for everyone, but rather to service a system where there were built-in inequities. And so
mhm.
because of that, all of these systems have operated inside of a broader kind of system of whiteness.
Mhm. Yes, thank you so much for that because I think it's important for our listeners to really understand the depths of what we're talking about, particularly as we think of being in a post-Obama era,
Mhm.
right? And thinking about, this idea that we are now on equal footing because we have elected a Black president. And, your book is talking about how we see this white lash happening. And because of, as you mentioned, as you were talking about this idea of once folks have bought into this idea of whitenesses and have actually received the privileges and benefits of whiteness in a system, right, that puts whiteness at the top of a hierarchy, then any type of equity or moves towards equality feels like you're losing something. And of course, the instinct is, well, we must protect that.
Mhm. 100%. Right. This idea that we have to protect that. And it also, what it does is it skews a perspective, right? That again, it creates a feeling of scarcity even when you have abundance,
Mm-hmm.
right? You've got 10 Lamborghinis, and so we give one to someone else, and all you know is you have one fewer Lamborghini,
Right.
right? Like it's not actually an objective measure about whether or not you have enough, whether or not you are doing well, whether or not you've got more. That it's this idea that you have less than you once had, that
Right.
someone else is now benefiting at your expense, right? And we see that apply at a societal level, right? We
Mm-hmm.
see that play out in housing and in education, in the way that we segregate ourselves and the response and the backlash very often to these programs. It's really interesting. We were talking about the affirmative action ruling you mentioned
Mm-hmm.
earlier, and Clarence Thomas, a more
Mm-hmm.
conservative Black uh, Supreme Court justice, this has been one of his missions in public life to undo affirmative action. And
Mm-hmm.
what is interesting is that when you read his writings about it, when you should listen to, if folks haven't, my friend Joel Anderson did a great podcast with Slate called Slow Burn, where he tells a story of Clarence Thomas and where he comes from. His 4 episodes came out this year, and so it was perfectly timed. But
Mm-hmm.
he tells this story about how Clarence Thomas, got into his undergrad and I think his law school based on affirmative action policies. And
Mm-hmm.
he was extremely resentful of the fact that in all of these spaces, he had to interact with white people who were constantly telling him that he didn't deserve to be where he was.
Mm-hmm.
Now, what's interesting is that Clarence Thomas is describing what we would now describe as like a microaggression or as a whitelash, right?
Mm-hmm.
This idea that a step to provide equitable access to Clarence Thomas and other Black people of that generation, to make it the same as white people, was perceived as the white people as coming at their expense and
Mm-hmm.
prompted them to express hostility towards him, right?
Absolutely.
And so he lays out exactly what this American whitelash is.
Mm-hmm. And as you stated, I mean, just I'm having trouble finding the words right now because we have Clarence Thomas, who is, holding this position highest in the land, benefiting from affirmative action, and now making, being part of the folks who are making this decision, saying that affirmative action is unnecessary. And as I mentioned in the intro, even advancing implicitly this idea of reverse racism.
Mm-hmm. This idea that somehow white Americans are being discriminated against. What's interesting is that there's polling that shows by the end of the Obama administration that 55% of white Americans believe that they are discriminated against racially. That by
Mm-hmm.
having one Black president, the average white American now believes they're a racial minority in essence, right? That they face systemic and structural discrimination, right?
Mm-hmm.
That, I think that speaks to um, the moment we're in. It actually helps begin to explain a lot about what
Mm-hmm.
has happened in our country, how it has operated. And so I think that we have to now. One thing that is true, if we're going to talk about affirmative action, right, which is obviously a specific type of policy and a specific set of policies, right? It's unquestionably true that there are good faith critiques of the application of
Mm-hmm.
given programs, right? That doesn't mean Harvard was doing its thing the way it's supposed to be doing its thing,
Mm-hmm.
right? That is not to say that someone could not create a program under the guise of attempting to achieve more equity that in fact does kind of like proactively discriminate in an unacceptable way against whomever, right?
Mm-hmm.
But what we know is the politics of this moment fall
Correct.
into a rhetoric and into a moment when so many people believe that there's some type of sweeping structural discrimination against them,
Mm-hmm.
even as we know that that is not in fact the society we live in.
Right, absolutely. When I read that polling data in the book, I was shocked at this idea that white folks are feeling as if they are the discriminated class in America. But as you mentioned, here we are in this particular time period, for us that might seem very new. right? Particularly given, as you mentioned, the politics of the time, the rhetoric of the moment. And for folks, it might seem like, wow, how is this happening now? What is unique about this time? But as you show us throughout the book, this is not something that's wholly unique and that we could not have predicted in many ways.
Mhm. Well, it's that we see throughout our history moments like this. There's a great book everyone should read by Carol Anderson called White Rage, and it talks about historian Carol Anderson. And it talks about and it looks at the the idea that throughout our history, moments of Black advancement are the ones that prompt full-throated white rage and attacks. And so she looks at the period following Reconstruction and the rise of Jim Crow. She looks at the periods following civil rights and the rise of new versions and new innovations in school segregation to follow the desegregation of public schools. And so what we know across our history is that in spaces and in moments when there is Black advancement and strides towards a multiracial democracy in which Black people are seen as fully human or feel and fully citizen, right? And not just Black people, but also immigrants and refugees, people who are not coded as white in our country, right? Those are the moments in which there is pushback. And so we look at so many moments throughout our history, the response to the attempt at multiracial government during Reconstruction, the rise of the Ku Klux Klan in the 1920s, and the Jim Crow era, the response to civil rights, which is a massive crackdown on civil liberties, as well as the resegregation of American education via private schools and via private schools and the homeschooling movement. And now what have we seen in our movement now? A Black man with kind of a funny name, Barack Obama, gets elected president, and a movement emerges, and that movement seizes control of one of our major political parties. And that movement says that the Black guy elected president isn't really one of us, that he's a secret Kenyan Muslim who hates white people, who doesn't believe in American exceptionalism. These aren't my words. These are all literal attacks that happen, right? And what we're going to do is we're going to elect a guy who set out on a crusade to prove that this guy wasn't a real American, and who promises us that if we elect him, he's going to build a wall on our border to prevent other scary brown people from coming in, and he's going to ban all Muslims from coming to our country, right? We see in this moment a spike in white supremacist terror incidents and attacks. We see the FBI says that the biggest terror threat facing the United States of America today is homegrown domestic white supremacist terrorism, right? And so what we see in this moment is a rise and a spike and a demonstration of a whitelash, of a violent, interpersonal, systemic, and structural response to what is perceived as a step towards multiracial democracy by people who are worried that they will be the losers of history, that multiracial democracy will take something from them that they can't get back.
We'll be right back. This is Let's Grab Coffee on WYXR 91.7 FM. You're listening to Let's Grab Coffee on WYXR 91.7 FM. I'm Sanaa, and we are chatting with Wesley Lowery. He is the author of American Whitelash, A Changing Nation and the Cost of Progress. You know, what I appreciate about your book is that you spend a lot of time really talking about this process of white radicalization, and particularly in ways that I think that we often don't hear in the media, right? You're able in this book to really give us a history both of the different waves of white supremacist movement and charting it to its present iteration, but then also talking through, I think we have this idea of folks are radicalized in a variety of different ways. But I'm wondering if you could kind of share what you found in your work when we think about white radicalization.
Sure, I think there are a few things. I think the first is that I think we have to challenge the predominant societal belief that there are like angels and demons, good people and bad people, right? That, well, this person is just evil, so therefore there's nothing we can understand, there's no way we can explain it, blah, blah, blah. I don't believe that. Right. I think that humans are humans.
Hmm.
Humans do good things and bad things. No one's all good. No one's all bad. And that we are socialized in the way we are socialized, and in a stew of all types of structures and systems that influence us in different ways. And that very often we're all acting and reacting out of a place of our own unresolved traumas, right? And so what's interesting is so many of these guys, and a lot of them are men. It's not exclusively men. There are some women, but a
Hmm.
lot of these guys are responding to what are, in a lot of ways, very both basic and common childhood traumas, right? Whether
Hmm.
that's relationships with their parents, whether that's concerns with bullying or being ostracized, whether it's drug and alcohol abuse issues that stem from being abused or from other things, right? Where what they're searching for is community and belonging, that they
Right.
want to, and a belief system and an ideology that tells them that they're victims, that there's a conspiracy against
Hmm.
them, that there's someone they can blame for their problems. And so it's not that they're a loser. It's not that they screwed up. In fact, they are the only ones who know what's really happened.
Right. Hmm.
Right? That's the draw of conspiracies,
Hmm.
right? The belief that you can see something that explains the world that no one else can see, because now you're no longer just a speck on a ball planet floating around in the sky. You're in the movie. You're the
Yeah.
main character. You're the important person who has to wake up everyone and open their eyes to this thing that no one else can see and no one else understands, and they won't let you talk about, and the books are secret and you got to pass them, so you start to see how this then self-perpetuates, because once you believe that, once you're on that train, any attempt to dissuade you of it only further proves the point, because everyone's out
Exactly.
against you and they don't want you to know this, and of course it got banned from the internet because everything feeds in the conspiracy. It's a snake that it's eating its tail constantly, right? And so
Hmm.
what we see, these guys, the way they get radicalized, and the way they get radicalized also via our public square, right? Because we
Hmm.
know these ideas are intoxicating, it makes it extremely important for us to be aware and to be smart about what we allow into our public square in the first place.
Absolutely.
Because what we see is that, there's a sociologist, Gordon Alpert, who writes this like definitive study on prejudice, how it manifests, what it looks like. And he writes about how we all have prejudice, right? We walk down the
Mhm.
street and we're like, oh, that person's attractive, that person's unattractive, I like their voice, they look scary, they look safe, they look right. And those prejudices are based on our own experiences,
Mhm.
right? Like where who has been trustworthy to us in the past, or who is familiar, who isn't, right? Like,
Mhm.
and so those prejudices are human. It's not something that makes you, again, a terrible person or X, Y, and Z, right? The issue is those prejudices that we all possess, they can start moving along a conveyor belt.
Mhm.
That when we see people in the public square, in positions of power and authority, whether it be a parent or a teacher or a president of the United States, right? When people who we admire, who have power, reflect our prejudices back to us, when they say the thing we're thinking or that we're
Mhm.
ashamed that we're thinking,
Mhm.
it provides us a permission structure to not be ashamed of those prejudices, first of all. Second of all, to voice them ourselves, then further amplifying them. Three, to then begin operating and acting out our discrimination. It's where we go from prejudice to discrimination, where what we start seeing is we start with segregation. So I'm just going to stay away from those people.
Mhm.
Then we move to active discrimination. I'm not going to invite that person to the party, or I'm not going to hire someone like that, or we're not going to tell so and so about this. Then you move to like interpersonal animus, where you're more quick to snap at someone who bumps into you on the street, or who pulls up next to you in the car, right? Or more likely to get in a fight with someone, to feel a physical threatening. And eventually you get to the point where you actually have full-fledged societal violence being committed, because the people who are the recipients of this prejudice have been so dehumanized by this language, by this rhetoric, and by this scale
Mhm.
of aggression, that now, when someone is no longer seen as a human in your eyes, you don't have to treat them like one.
Mhm.
And so we see this, and we see this play out time and time again, and we see the effort. You look at someone like Dylan Roof, who committed the shooting in Charleston in 2015. And this is a black kid, or a white kid, I'm sorry, in South Carolina, who's got, base level normal prejudice, and who, and following the news coverage of the Trayvon Martin case, begins Google searching for more information about quote unquote black on white crime and homicides.
Mm-hmm.
And he finds himself on these white supremacist message boards and websites and ideologies. And before long, he is writing a manifesto about the quote Jewish problem and marching into a church to murder innocent black churchgoers as they pray. Right?
Mm-hmm.
How do you get to that point? It's when you dehumanize and villainize people so much that you no longer see them as human, that you no longer see them as entitled to equality and safety and justice, and in which you are willing to believe these vile conspiracy theories about them.
Mm-hmm. I mean, as I was reading your book, something that continued to come up to me, and I love how you include all of these great references to other work. So if folks want to learn more, they can definitely grab, some additional readings. But to your point about this dehumanization process, as you talk about in your book, and even as we were talking today, our nation has been built upon these ideas of othering, right? Whether it's through xenophobia or other forms of racism and discrimination. And so to some degree, we're already exposed to these ideas. And so once, as you mentioned, we see folks who are in positions of power espousing those same ideas and doing so freely, it does give people permission, as you noted, to say those same ideas out loud and then to start acting on them. And so I think we're, as you mentioned, in a unique space where we have the internet, where it makes it much easier to continue to find more and more about these ideas, these very dangerous ideas, but also to connect with other people who are believing these same things as well.
Mm-hmm. It's a sense of being able to find community. Think about what internet and social media and our phones, what they've done. They've allowed us to connect with people all around the world. And they've allowed us to do that in beautiful ways. They then rise to movements that wouldn't have existed, to build friendships and connections with people you never could have found otherwise.
Mm-hmm.
But those tools aren't only available to people who are trying to all talk about their love of their favorite novel or share their oil paintings or recipes, right? It's available to everyone, of different political persuasions, of different backgrounds. And so what we've seen is the ability of not only of people to find those who share and express the same prejudices, but for them to egg each other on and to take each other on a journey farther and deeper into some of these depths.
Mm-hmm, absolutely. And we see what happens time and again, as you talk about in the book, some very key instances of racial violence. And something else that I really appreciated is, expanding this idea, as you do in your book, that is not just white supremacy that is impacting Black folks, but also anyone who is deemed as not white. And I think in this nation, our discussion about race and racism is very much tethered to a white-Black binary, which limits some of our ability to actually address racial inequality more broadly.
I think that it does. And I think I'm someone, in part because of the body of work I've done that focuses a lot on anti-Blackness and anti-Black racism. I understand and really appreciate the distinct and unique histories of these different types of prejudice, right?
Mm-hmm.
But what is also true is understanding where there is overlap and overlay, because I think sometimes we go, okay, that's someone else's problem. That's not on me. One of the examples I like to use is the Tree of Life massacre in Pittsburgh, I think the deadliest anti-Semitic attack in American history. And the reason that man walked into that synagogue and killed those Jewish people was because he believed that synagogue was helping resettle refugees in the United States of America, and that was going to lead to the Great Replacement, to a white genocide of white people. So it's unquestionably an anti-Semitic attack. The conspiracy theory at the heart of this white supremacist belief is anti-Semitic, right? The Jews are pulling the levers of all this stuff, but it's also a xenophobic attack.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And so to understand it only in one lens doesn't actually help us understand it in both. And so we have to look at both of those things. And so, by the way, if you are someone who's working on behalf of refugees or of immigrants, right, or someone who cares about their safety and their livelihood, it really matters that this has happened, right? You have to understand it. You can't say, okay, that's for the Jewish, not anti-hate groups to deal with, right? The person who walks into the mosque, does it because, there aren't enough immigrants close enough, or he can't find enough Jews, or the black people are far away, right? That it's the same, this hostility manifests in all of these different ways towards non-white people. And so we can both understand how these things have manifested specifically against one group or another over history and how they
Yes.
exist today, while also understanding that all these things work in concert together.
Absolutely. So important. And I think you do a great job throughout the book really explaining that so we can have a fuller understanding of this moment that we're in, but also where we have been throughout our history as well. We'll be right back. This is Let's Grab Coffee on WYXR 91.7 FM. You're listening to Let's Grab Coffee on WYXR 91.7 FM. I'm Sanaa, and this morning we're here with Wesley Lowery. His latest book is American Whitelash, A Changing Nation and the Cost of Progress. Something that you've mentioned throughout our conversation is this idea of these different narratives that we're learning. And one thing that I feel like is very important, and you mentioned in the book as well, is really, the public square and how media is covering a lot of these different events. And one thing that we've seen, I think, maybe growing in the past several years is this idea that we have to give, airtime to quote unquote both sides.
Mhm.
And I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit more about what you see as the media's role in the type of rhetoric that we're seeing very much proliferating throughout our society right now.
I think the media plays a big role, because I think the media, while we're not gatekeepers of the public square, I do think we're the facilitators of the public square,
Mhm.
right? We don't get to decide who's in the room. We don't get to decide what those people want to say or what they want to do. But we are the people walking around holding the microphone. And so we can't always stop someone when they want to say, when they do a comment instead of a question, or when they ignore the question we asked,
Mhm.
right? But we do actually get to decide who has the microphone. Now, someone can just go stand in the corner screaming, right? And that's not to say they
Mhm.
won't get any of their message out and people won't see any of it, but we still do hold the biggest microphone,
Mhm.
right? And I think we have a responsibility to how we facilitate that conversation, and we have to make curatorial decisions about who we call on, how we call on them, and also what questions we ask them. Right, that there are some questions that are not worth asking in the public square. There are some
Mhm.
debates not worth having, and I think that we could just do a much better job of that. I think that there is a when we look at issues of our democracy, we have to think about what is our role as the media, right?
Mhm.
Institutions are the things that hold up, they're the pillars that hold up a society, right? And so the media is one of those institutions. And so, what is it that we're holding up? What is our foundational cornerstone?
Mhm.
And, and I think we've operated for a long time that our foundational cornerstone is speech, right? Is debate, is open, I think that there is I understand that argument, and there's a liberal argument for it, and I, as someone who works in the media, care a lot about speech
Mhm.
and public debate. But I do wonder if it is possible to have that be coherent with a society that now wants to be a multiracial democracy.
Mm.
That what do you do with people who would use their speech to undermine other people's humanities? That
Yeah.
there are moments and there are points where you cannot be an absolutist about both things,
Mhm.
right? You either let the Charlottesville rally happen or you do not, right?
Mhm.
And what we know is that when people express dehumanizing language and hatred and rally in those ways, it leads to violence.
Mhm.
It's not an opinion, it's not an idea. We know it historically. And so
Right.
we have to make a decision about whether we will be a society. And again, this is not an argument about sometimes speech is violent. No, but there are types of speech that lead to violence. We know that,
Right.
right?
Mhm.
And there actually is a good faith academic debate to be had about if speech can be violence next Wednesday. But setting that aside, like people in the public square like to jump on that formulation. So let's set that aside.
Mhm.
We know that when types of people can be routinely dehumanized in the public square, and people who have been historically dehumanized in the public square, we know when that kicks up, more of those people lose their lives.
Mhm.
So if we are a nation, if we are a country that values first and foremost that all men are created equal, or all people are created equal, all humans are created equal, then and we are one that seeks now to be a multiracial democracy where each individual has access to the rights and liberties and justice promised in our founding documents, then that would require us to think about what role our institutions play in reinforcing that idea, right? And that our
Mhm.
institutions play different roles. That something can be legal, but the media can play the role of keeping it out of our conversation, right?
Mhm.
Something can be legal, but a bank can decide not to lend them money or not to allow them to check it, to work at such place. Something can be legal, but it can be taught in a certain way in schools that makes it clear that it's unacceptable, right? And
Mhm.
so what we've seen, and then by the way, there can be changes to what is legal and what is not through the legal system and structure.
Right.
And so the reality is we have to decide. And
Mhm.
what I would suggest is, and this is a really hard space to get into, it's easy in more civil rights spaces and activist spaces, it's much harder in media spaces because media people are very knee-jerk free speech absolutist,
Mhm.
right? And I get it, I understand it. I mean, I care a lot and I'm on the board of any number of press freedom groups. The First Amendment matters a lot to me.
Mhm.
And also, there is a real conversation about where these lines are, what the trade-offs are, and that there are societies, Germany, for example, where there are laws and restrictions about what you can do and what you can't do. You know who would not have allowed the Charlottesville rally? Germany. But I don't know that anyone would suggest that Germany is not a free society that does not value speech and does not value debate. And
Mhm.
so I think that what we understand is just because something has been one way in the past doesn't mean it has to be that way forever in the future.
Yeah, absolutely. As I was listening to you just now is making me think of, living in that both and, right? Where, both things can be true or something can be true, but also something else can be true. We need to think about that. And I'm just wondering, are we even able to have these type of nuanced conversations in the public square where it does seem like particularly with Trump has given way to a type of speech where, oh, you can say anything from a public platform as an elected official, as a person in power, and it's just okay, where we're not having a lot of that dialogue anymore.
Mhm.
So I'm definitely thinking, more about this. How can we actually have dialogue that maybe leads to some sort of changes where we are acknowledging, what our shared collective values are. Hopefully these ideas that we are equal, that that we all should have the same rights. And I'm not sure, if we will get there, what will need to happen in order for us to get there.
Well, and I think it's important for us to remember that there's still ongoing discussion and debate of this, right? That not
Mhm.
everyone believes we should have the same rights, and everyone believes not everyone believes we should continue to have multiracial democracy the way that we have it currently, right?
Right.
And so I think that that's something we have to think about and something we have to navigate. And so I think that there's a real, you know, difficulty in having these conversations in public and having these conversations in this public square. And it's almost becomes impossible to have serious conversations in public and in the public square
Mhm.
with the way that our information ecosystem works, where everything is an argument, everything is debate, everything is partisan, everything is it. What we know is when we discuss hard things, the way you discuss them and the way you move through them is through kind of like love and sensitivity and good faith and understanding and right if
Mhm.
you and your partner got to discuss something difficult, you're not like, what's the best way to do this? Let's go on cable news. And then, like, if we could get like 2 minutes with a moderator interrupting us, we can solve like what state we should be in or which college acceptance you should take, or like if this straw was the last straw or you're really moving out, right? We would
Right.
never discuss any difficult thing in our personal life in any of the forums we have created in public life to discuss difficult things.
Mhm.
So like let's solve racism and patriarchy, like, and let's do it like like I said, let's do it on live television. That's gonna work.
Right.
Let's do it on the internet with a bunch of random people who don't know us and we can only write in sentence fragments. All right, that'll work. You know,
Right. Oh, why isn't this working? I just don't understand.
It's like, y'all realize what we're doing, right? This wasn't gonna work.
Right. Yes, absolutely. But as you mentioned, I'm thinking through these things, particularly as being a sociologist, being a professor in Tennessee, having our newest version of a divisive concepts bill gone into effect, and so thinking through too, like how do I, have facilitate these type of discussions in a classroom, right? Because I know that young people who are listening, want to understand the moment that we're in, want to have the tools to understand it, but also to make hopefully positive social change. So these are all, questions that I am personally, working through in this moment. And so what I'm hearing is that I shouldn't set up a Twitter chat and have my students just talk at each other on the internet, right?
Well, see, but at least your students are in community with each other.
Yes.
They've done the
Mhm.
same reading, or at least pretending to have done the same reading, right? That they
Yes.
have things that are it's why. Now look, I wouldn't necessarily recommend discussing difficult things via text message, even with people you know closely, but we have a way better chance of that working than like with a literal random person,
Mhm.
right? Like sometimes you can navigate difficulties, but let's think about how many of us get in fights with our parents or with their loved ones or their, spouses, right? Because we talked about something hard over text message and there was no tone, there was no context, we were reacting very literally to the words that were said, not to the
Mhm.
other stuff, right?
Right.
And so I think that there is a real, there's something to be said about how do we facilitate conversation? How do we facilitate conversation that has the ability or the potential to actually be productive? And I
Mhm.
think that very often requires some level of shared stakes, of shared community, of shared background, right? So again, your students at least kind of
Yeah.
know each other. You guys have had conversations. You can reference, well, but because last week in the, and I think increasingly across the country we have less and less of that. We're in different
Mhm.
information ecosystems. We're consuming different popular culture. We're listening to different music. We live in different places. What's actually like in my neighborhood, in my town, is actually totally different than what it's like where someone else of different politics lives, because we've sorted geographically that way.
Mhm.
We are literally having the same conversation, but having it about different worlds because we live in different worlds.
Absolutely. And I think that's so important to remember. We do very much value our lived experience as the true experience, right? And so we're often missing each other in conversation. And so I think it's important, as you noted, that we build these relationships, and particularly that we have a shared source of knowledge that we're operating from, right? Like my students who pretend to do the reading or who might ask ChatGPT for a summary of the
Mm-hmm.
reading, but at least having some sort of shared understanding that we can then work through together as we have some of these difficult conversations. I see your book, American Whitelash, A Changing Nation and the Cost of Progress, as that sort of text that can serve as a shared foundation of knowledge as we have some of these difficult conversations. And also, since you did mention Allport, what's coming to mind is Allport's contact theory. So it's not just he didn't just have a theory about how we move from these attitudes and actions that are very much about discrimination or even potentially genocide, but also he had a theory about how we actually can address these prejudices as well. And so thinking about who we are in relationship with, and how we foster relationships so that we can actually learn about one another and alongside with one another as well.
Exactly. No, and that makes a lot of sense, and I think it's important. Now, but I do think that what we have to do is we have to think about in the application, right?
Mhm.
I think that there's a desire sometimes for a belief that like the passage of time will just solve it. Right. Well, because like our kids are going to grow up around like some black kids and there'll be immigrants here and there. It's like, no, no, no. What's going to happen is we're going to construct entire like new structures to segregate ourselves. Right.
Right.
That the belief or the idea was that the desegregation of public schools was just going to fix all this and solve all this. Not among everyone. I'm not saying the civil rights activists thought this, right? But
Mhm.
among many of the white moderates, white liberals, right, and even some of the black liberals, right, without the thinking about and the consideration of the reality that no, what's going to happen is we're going to construct an entire parallel education system to maintain that segregation. That
Mm-hmm.
when Black people start moving in these neighborhoods, white people are going to literally build new neighborhoods called the suburbs to get away from them, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so
Yes.
we cannot assume that steps towards that creating that contact will in fact guarantee that there is sustained contact.
Right. Absolutely. Yes. I mean, it is a very specific type of contact, specific type of relationships. And importantly, as you mentioned before, that idea of shared stakes, right? That we see ourselves trying to accomplish the same goal and not simply just, waving at a neighbor down the street as we
Mhm.
are secretly, trying to move, right? So absolutely very
Well,
important.
when we think about this idea, we talk about the idea in Black political science of linked fate, the
Mm-hmm.
idea that Black Americans across the political spectrum, Black conservative, believe that their fate and their outcome are linked to other Black Americans, right? Which is one of the reasons why you see, in a lot of ways, such ideological consistency among Black Americans. Not that there's not a diversity of belief, right? But that there is a relative consistency of behavior, because what people recognize and understand is that if you are hostile to some Black Americans, even if you agree with my politics, you are bad for me.
Mm-hmm.
And so you have people routinely voting for politicians in Black Americans routinely voting for politicians with whom they actually disagree with on a lot of issues, but who they see as correct on the one issue or the best available option on the one issue that is supreme, which is the linked fate of Black Americans.
Mm-hmm.
Right. But if you are prejudiced or racist against Black people, this ain't gonna work for me.
Right.
Not theoretically, this isn't some like virtuous stand. It's like, I can't trust you. This is gonna not work out for me.
Mm-hmm.
And so what we have to think about in terms of contact theory, and what we have to think about in terms of how we create a multiracial democracy, is a world in which linked fate transcends these socialized racial groups, and
Mm-hmm.
in which men truly believe they cannot receive justice in a world where women cannot receive justice, where where straight people genuinely believe that they do not receive justice if they don't live in a world where LGBTQ people receive justice, where, and where white Americans genuinely believe that if this is a world that does not provide justice for Black Americans, for brown Americans, for non-white Americans, that is a world where they cannot receive justice either. That if we can achieve that linked fate, that's what then actually creates the type of coalition that works in a multiracial democracy.
Yes, and I'm listening to you and I'm thinking, what would it take for that type of interest convergence to happen?
Mhm.
And it seems like a very big hurdle, knowing what we know. Um, but I am hopeful. Um, what is giving you hope these days?
I think about, you know, as I said earlier, I think about our history as a tug of war. And so every time there's a pull in favor of white supremacist violence and backlash, that gives rise to a new generation of anti-racist activism.
Mm-hmm.
And so in these moments, what we see are young activists, old activists, elected officials who are making strides in so many places around the country, that are interesting, right? We see the reparations movement is at the height it's ever been at in American history, right? And
Mm-hmm.
so I think that there is a real, again, it's a tug of war. Sometimes the question we ask is, are things getting better? And the answer is both yes and no,
Mm-hmm.
because as there are strides towards multiracial democracy, it will create and propel a more fervent and desperate white supremacist movement. There will be backlash. And then that backlash will in turn lead to the next movement of anti-racist activism and strides towards multiracial democracy.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Well, Wesley, it has been such a pleasure to chat with you today. Thank you so much for writing this book. I hope that everyone reads it. Thank you again for your time.
Of course, thank you.
Thank you again to Wesley Lowery. His book is American Whitelash, A Changing Nation and the Cost of Progress. I think this book is so important to helping us understand the moment that we're in, but most importantly, for contextualizing it within the longer history of the United States. In it, he also talks about 6 cases of white racial violence that have occurred over the past decade. Some of them that you will likely be familiar with, for example, like the racist rally in Charlottesville, Virginia. And I think it's important to understanding what whitelash is, but then also thinking about what actions might we take as we work towards anti-racism. Like any good piece of writing, this book definitely moved me. It moved me to feel a lot of different feelings, but also movement to action. And I think that's really key. As Wesley talked about today, it's not just a matter of time passing and things are going to magically get better, but there has to be coordinated action to work towards positive social change. For today's positive note, I want to leave you with this quote from James Baldwin from his 1962 essay titled As Much Truth as One Can Bear. He says, "We are the generation that must throw everything into the endeavor to remake America into what we say we want it to be. Without this endeavor, we will perish. Not everything that is faced can be changed, but nothing can be changed until it is faced." This has been Let's Grab Coffee on WYXR. I'm Sanaa, and I'm here every Monday morning. Make sure you subscribe to Let's Grab Coffee in podcast format so you never miss a conversation. And if you're anything like me, then there are definitely some moments in today's chat that I want to go back and dig deeper into, listen to again. Maybe that's you too. And subscribing in podcast format allows you to do that. And of course, makes it easy for you to share this show with a friend. I can't wait to be back with you again next Monday morning.